Glenn Robinson, President of the World Affairs Council of the Monterey Bay Area. I would like to welcome you to our newest edition of Quick Takes on International Affairs. Please enjoy this talk and do consider joining the World Affairs Council.
Hello, my name is Tom Fingar, and I'm very pleased to have been invited to speak to the Monterey Peninsula World Affairs Council on the subject of China's grand strategy. The current and relatively recent narrative about China and US-China relations posits that Beijing has a comprehensive, or in quotes, grand strategy that is dangerous to American values and the US-led international order. Some variants also maintain that the Chinese party state will prevail unless the United States responds effectively with a countering strategy of our own. In the next few minutes, I hope to convince you that virtually all aspects of this narrative are wrong. China does have a national strategy, but to characterize it as comprehensive, unique, or completely diabolical is a misleading exaggeration. In most cases, grand strategy, like beauty, exists largely in the eye of the beholder. What is described as a detailed and oftentimes secret plan is more often an analytic construct deduced to explain what a country does, is doing, or will do in the future. Many proponents of the current narrative imply that China's grand strategy is more than this. Indeed, that it is a multifaceted blueprint to displace the United States, disrupt the international order, and achieve global hegemony that was foolishly ignored by policymakers in Washington and elsewhere. It isn't. Some versions of the narrative were constructed by officials in Beijing to persuade their own citizens that the Communist Party-led regime and Supreme Leader Xi Jinping should be trusted and supported because they have a bold strategy to achieve multiplicity of aspirational goals. Other variants, constructed by geostrategic thinkers and China bashers, impute coherence and malign intent to what is more often a disparate collection of discrete developments and soaring ambitions. In all cases, descriptions exaggerate reality and confuse rhetoric with intent and capability. One oft-cited illustration of China's alleged master plan is the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. The collection of activities and objectives now subsumed under the BRI label was originally announced by Xi Jinping on a visit to Kazakhstan in 2013 and expanded when he visited Indonesia the same year. Originally billed as an initiative to build infrastructure in Central, South, and Southeast Asia to facilitate connectivity and economic development, BRI has morphed into a collection of real and imagined goals and activities with something for everyone and something to fear for everyone. Adding pursuit of the Belt and Road Initiative to the Communist Party Constitution in 2017 made the undertaking more prominent, but no less vague. The genesis of the BRI proposal was excess capacity in China, especially in construction-related industries like steel, cement, and heavy equipment. By 2013, China had largely completed the construction of ports, rail lines, highways, and housing begun in the late 1970s. As in many other sectors of China's economy, pursuit of GDP growth, minimal attention to economic return, easy access to capital, and other characteristics of China's non-market economy had resulted in excess capacity and decreasing return on investment. Beijing was faced with the prospect of closing factories, dismissing millions of workers, and reducing revenues needed by local governments to meet growing demand for social services. The solution was to use China's construction capacity to build infrastructure in other countries. When the BRI was announced, Beijing made it sound like China would pay for projects. And naturally, there was widespread enthusiasm in parts of the world with infrastructure deficits. However, it quickly became apparent that most projects would be funded with loans. The loans would be from Chinese banks and they'd have to be repaid. The priority assigned to the BRI by party leaders paved the way for governments, Chinese local governments, and firms to scramble for a piece of the action. It did not take long for the hype to begin. Ordinary Chinese understandably began to ask why Beijing was, in quotes, giving money to people and countries who were wealthier than they were. Chinese economists questioned the viability of proposed projects and the will and ability of host countries to repay loans. Justifying the now vaunted BRI as a glorified jobs project simply wouldn't be good enough. So propagandists and Chinese geostrategic thinkers began to add other justifications. This soon spawned arguments that the project would increase China's own prosperity, security, and international influence. Less friendly foreign commentators began to describe the projects as a means to tie partner economies to China in ways that would make them dependent on and responsive to Beijing. Terms like, in quote, debt trap diplomacy, end quote, were used to decry what China was doing. And quote, normal, unquote, investment practices like demands for collateral were denounced as intended to facilitate Chinese takeover of key parts of foreign economies. The hype, both positive and negative, has a modicum of truth, but it also has a large measure of exaggeration. Most of what has actually happened under the BRI rubric has been undertaken by local governments in China and by Chinese firms without the involvement or funding from Beijing. And it amounts to far less than evidence of successful geopolitical strategy. Other evidence cited to prove that both China has a grand strategy and that the strategy is dangerous for US interests includes Beijing's declared and later muted intention to become the world leader in 10 technologies that will shape the future. Technologies such as robotics, aerospace, and artificial intelligence. These are ambitious aspirational goals, but aspiration is not the same as achievement. Beijing is investing a lot of R&D money in each of these fields, protecting domestic industries from foreign competition, and trying to acquire know-how and technical capabilities by both licit and illicit means. But dreaming is not the same as doing, and some elements of the Chinese approach, or quote, strategy, end quote, are highly problematic. Factors inherent in Beijing's current approach that appear likely to impede attainment of the goals include heavy reliance on protected monopolies to lead innovation. Monopolies are not known to be particularly innovative. Also includes exhortations to be inventive and entrepreneurial. But those exhortations are constrained by injunctions to eschew foreign inputs and politically incorrect ideas. These contradictory injunctions might be summarized as think outside the box, but don't color outside the lines. China probably will do well in some of these areas, but it will not succeed in all of them. The current narrative about an unstoppable Chinese juggernaut assumes greater success than is achievable. Time constraints preclude discussion of other alleged evidence and manifestations of China's putative grand strategy. So I will simply note that they are equally problematic. For example, the man-made islands in the South China Sea are essentially landing strips and missile emplacements built on sandbars with a total area roughly equivalent to 1/3 the size of the Stanford campus. They are good for intimidating small neighbors, but they wouldn't last long in a serious military conflict. And they don't do much to enhance China's ability to project force across the Pacific. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is another example. This bank, or AIIB, is a supplement and a complement to the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and other international financial institutions, not a rival to or replacement for the Bretton Woods institutions established by the United States after World War II. China's trade and investment in Africa increased rapidly until about 2016. And all but one African country is a member of the Beijing organized Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. But one commodity, oil, and 4 countries, Angola, South Africa, Liberia, and Ghana, account for 3/4 of PRC trade and investment in the continent. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization includes more than half the people in the world, but its only purpose is to hold occasional meetings and cooperate on counterterrorism activities. I could go on, and I encourage you to look into everything cited by proponents of the China threat. But here I will simply state that there is much less there than the hand-wringers imply. The China juggernaut version of a Chinese grand strategy may be exaggerated and unhelpful as a basis for understanding and engaging with the People's Republic. But that does not mean that Chinese behavior is not shaped by enduring goals, principles, and priorities. In the remainder of my time, I will sketch out my own analytic construct of the purpose and patterns of Chinese behavior. You might think of it as grand strategy with a small g and a small s. When Mao Zedong died in 1976, China was a mess. 30 years of experimentation and quest for a revolutionary path to wealth and power, after a century of civil war, foreign occupation, and failed attempts to modernize, had left China poor, weak, and incapable of meeting basic needs of its then rapidly increasing population. Deng Xiaoping and other veteran cadres were desperate to jumpstart the economy, restore political legitimacy, and improve the lot of the Chinese people. By 1978, they had decided to abandon experimentation and national self-sufficiency approaches to development in favor of adopting and sticking with a proven path to sustained growth. The path they chose was called the Japanese model, but it'd be more accurate to call it the Taiwan model of export-led growth. Washington held the key to China's ability to adopt that path or strategy. Without US acquiescence and support, China simply could not get access to the markets, capital, and technology of the United States itself and its free world allies. Deng's strategy of reform and opening became feasible only when the Carter administration signaled that the US was prepared to open the door to the free world and to facilitate China's acquisition of training, technology, investment capital, and markets necessary for the transition from imperial Chinese and Stalinist autarky to participation in the rules-based international order. The US did this not for altruistic reasons, but because it was an integral part of US Cold War strategy to counter the Soviet Union and communist ideology. It is not at all a coincidence that the new strategy and normalization of relations with the United States were announced at the same party plenum in December 1978. They were inextricably connected. The core elements of that 1978 strategy continue to shape Chinese policies and actions to this day. Departures from that strategy, including many made during the reign of Xi Jinping, have slowed growth and increased public discontent and Chinese leadership anxiety. Key elements and approaches of Deng's grand strategy were, and are, to use participation in the US-led liberal order to jumpstart and accelerate China's modernization and economic growth. This was not an all-in approach to participation. It was the opposite of such an approach. A bumper sticker way to characterize the approach was get in, get rich, and get out. China wanted to use, not join, the liberal order. It certainly did not want to become enmeshed and entrapped in the US-led system. Its goal and the strategy used to achieve it was to preserve as much as possible of the Chinese system inherited from imperial times, as modified by adoption of Leninist principles and Stalinist organizations. It would do this while acquiring attributes of modernity. In a sense, the goal was to use modern techniques and limited engagement with the outside world to preserve and strengthen legacy institutions. The objective was easy to state and difficult to achieve. Guidelines for implementing this strategy called for changing as little as possible, but also called for making changes necessary whenever making them was felt imperative in order to sustain economic growth. Do just enough, just in time, to keep the modernization bicycle from tipping over. This was to be a cautious and step-by-step strategy. The strategy accepted vulnerabilities of dependence on the United States and its free world allies, but it sought to limit them in both time and space. Temporary dependence would enable China to become richer and stronger and, eventually, to disengage from the US-led system. To mitigate vulnerabilities inherent in dependence on the United States, China pursues classic balance of power techniques that use the European Union and Japan to counterbalance US economic strength. It once used the Soviet Union to counterbalance US military power. It now uses its own greater military capability and participation in the United Nations Security Council, as well as its relations with many other countries, to dilute and constrain US power. Beijing views its step-at-a-time approach as necessary, prudent, and defensive. Maintaining Communist Party rule and maximizing China's freedom of action are more important objectives than displacing the US as a global leader. Over time, China has become more prosperous and more powerful, but it has not become more secure or less dependent on the rules-based order. Indeed, exactly the opposite. As its interests have expanded and its engagement on the world stage has increased, it has more to protect and a greater stake in a smoothly functioning international order. 40 years ago, when Chinese officials outlined their strategy of limited and temporary acceptance of rules and norms, quote, imposed, end quote, by the West, and the expectation that rapid growth would quickly enable them to disengage, some of us told one another, and a few of us told our Chinese counterparts, that China was welcome to try, but that the more it benefited from participation in the rules-based order, the more interdependent and more deeply engaged it would become, and the more costly it would become to disengage or decouple. That prediction has proven correct. China is now extremely dependent on the system that has facilitated its success and its stake in the system has made it a more active and effective contributor to the continued success of the order from which we all benefit. Beijing cannot disrupt that order without jeopardizing its own success and the legitimacy of the party-state regime. But like other major participants in and beneficiaries of the rules-based order, China recognizes the need for reform and expansion of its systems and its institutions. And understandably, it has ideas and wants a say in updating the system to meet 21st century needs. That does not make China a, quote, revisionist power. If, or to the extent that my compressed analysis here is correct, China's grand strategy requires stability and predictability in the international system, maintenance of regional and global peace, and continued cooperation with the countries with which it is most interdependent. These requirements make it far more likely that China will continue to pursue its interests by working with and within the existing system, and that it will attempt to disrupt or destroy that system. Pursuing its interests by working within the rules-based order is the only national strategy that has worked for China in the last 200 years. Beijing will have to decide whether it really wants to risk the likely consequences of abandoning that strategy, or adjust its own implementation of the strategy to ensure continued success. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak with you.